Excellent. So good morning. And let me just put up the slides. So today I will spend about the next 45 minutes talking about marketing technology, rich options, tough choices in a world of digital disruption. I'm going to start today's presentation talking about some of the key findings that we've had from our research on digital disruption, talk about what do digitally mature organizations do differently, how do marketers use the digital technologies to create value, both in terms of customer journeys and scalable marketing processes, and then start with a brief look ahead. When I'm done, we will have a panel of 3 distinguished colleagues, and we'll talk very specifically about content marketing, which is a critical part of how many organizations are using marketing technology. I'd like to start with a quote from one individual that I admire, Condoleezza Rice, who's former Secretary of State in the United States. And back in 2007, she was speaking at a conference, and I've heard her say this in different forums as well, that which one time seemed impossible in retrospect seems inevitable. And what she meant by that is many of the things which today we think about we could never envision, we'll look back in 10, 15 years and say, well, of course, that was likely to happen. So it was inspiring to listen to Dr. Jane talk about the future of the Institute, because I'm sure 10 years, 15 years from now, we'll look back and say, well, of course, it was inevitable that India would develop an organization like Geo Institute. We wrote this book about April 2019 was when it was published by MIT Press, and it's called The Technology Fallacy. And I'm going to start by sharing some research from the book. But the key premise of the book and what I'm going to talk about today is that just because digital technologies are causing much of the disruption that organizations are experiencing does not mean that the solution is simply to implement digital technologies. In fact, in many organizations, it's the cultural, the organizational, the strategic, the leadership, the talent, and the process issues, which are far more difficult and far more challenging to implement than simply choosing the right technologies. And in fact, cutting-edge technologies that are implemented in organizations where the organizational practices are outmoded are unlikely to achieve the benefits that they're looking to achieve. And that's true in marketing and operations and finance and the like. So as I said, I'll start with the key findings of the work that we did, which led to this book called The Technology Fallacy. And this book was 4 or 5 years in the making. And as part of this, along with colleagues from my former firm, Deloitte, as well as Jerry Kane, a professor at Boston College, we surveyed more than 16,000 business executives, managers, and analysts about their experience with digital disruptions and their perceptions of the nature and the adequacy of how their organizations responded. Our research covered more than 157 countries. About a third of those were from the US, but the main part of our respondents were from outside the US, and more than 30 different industry sectors, of which about a third of the respondents were from large organizations over $1 billion. In addition to the surveys we did, we also did interviews with C-suite and other executives, over 75 of those at leading organizations like Walmart, Marriott, and Google, and Salesforce, and extensive secondary research on issues about organizational behavior, operations, marketing, information science, and psychology. So not surprisingly, most of the organizations that we spoke to saw that digital and digital transformation was key to their future success. More than 85% of the organizations believe that if they can be effective as digital organizations, they will be more successful in the future. Now, we asked them to define their level of digital maturity, and approximately 30%, a little bit less than a third, defined themselves as mature. The bulk of the organizations were developing, and some viewed themselves as very early in the journey, going from digitally immature to mature. When we asked the question about what's the major difference between working in a digital organization and a traditional one, it was really about the pace of business. Digital businesses move more quickly. It was also about the culture and the mindset and the workplace, but it was mainly about pace of business. We also asked them to talk about digital relative to their business. And organizations that were digitally mature define themselves through the lens of being a digital organization, as opposed to an organization that simply uses digital technology. They tend to be more nimble. So words like agility, experimentation, rewards, collaboration, accepting the risk of failure, and organizing around cross-functional teams were all part and parcel of these more mature organizations. They also said they tended to be very experimental and that organizations encouraged them to experiment, and they were supportive. But most importantly, when they did experiment, whether they were successful or unsuccessful with these experiments, they were very good as an organization sharing the learnings and taking learnings from these experiments and propagating them throughout the entire organization. Not surprisingly, people want to work for digital organizations. What was surprising to us, if you look at this in terms of the age cohorts, was not only the younger ones, the millennials and the Gen Zs and the Gen Xs, but it was also people like myself, the baby boomers, who want to work for large digital organizations. When we said, what's the biggest challenge in terms of getting people to respond to digital disruption, the challenge which came up consistently was the challenge around getting people to take risks, try experiments, dealing in a world of ambiguity and constant change, and to much lesser extent was picking and choosing the right technology. And this notion of experimentation, and we often talk about this, and certainly in the US and Silicon Valley, we have this expression of fail fast. But the reality is, many of the people in traditional legacy organizations that we spoke to said the leaders talk about experimentation, but in fact don't really believe it. And taking risks which are unsuccessful is career limiting. So not surprisingly, the employees that we spoke to said they want their leaders to be willing to experiment, but to tolerate the failure that goes with experiments, because not all experiments can be successful. So when we sort of summed up all the research, what we did see was this huge gap. And colleagues at Stanford University have written about, they call it the knowing-doing gap, the gap between the 87% of organizations and respondents who believe that digital technologies will fundamentally disrupt the industries in which they participate in. But less than half of the individuals that responded feel that their organizations are adequately preparing for the disruptions that are projected to change their organizations. Now, certainly we live in a world today in 2020 of COVID-19. And one of the things that we've seen in the US, and I'm sure this is true in other countries as well, is the speed at which that has changed the assumptions that we have about how we operate. So suddenly now we have this external spark, which has caused us to focus much more on digital disruption, digital transformation than ever before. And it's done in a compressed time frame that would be hard to imagine. So just a simple thing, if you look at the topic of contactless delivery, which has become big in the US for food, if you do a search on Google Trends, you'll see that in April of 2020, there were more than 10 times as many searches on Google for contactless delivery as was back in November before we experienced COVID-19. I want to talk a little bit about what do these digitally mature organizations do differently, and then I'll segue to talk about what does this mean for marketers. So we observed that there were 4 characteristics of the digitally mature organizations that they built into what we've called their digital DNA. And those help them to bridge that knowing-doing gap. So the first one is digital absorption. And what we mean by that is the ability of organizations to identify new innovations, assimilate those organizations, and it's a capacity or capability that gets learned over time. And companies that are good at doing this get better and better and better when they learn how to find, identify, and then absorb these new innovations. So what do? Number one is that they're very good at sensing. They look at what competition does. Yesterday, Jim Lachinsky talked about, at the beginning of the speech, Starbucks and their use of this artificial intelligence technology called Deep Brew. So that may not necessarily be relevant directly to organizations that are not in the service business, but there's something in that all organizations need to do and say, what would Starbucks do? What would Amazon do? And so forth. And I talk with my students and I talk with organizations that we interact with. And all of a sudden we have competitors that we never would have thought were competitors before. So increasingly, organizations like Amazon in the US is an organization where businesses that never thought they'd have to worry about Amazon, which started out in 1997 selling books through the mail, suddenly has become a competitor. So sensing and keeping track of what other organizations outside. Second is they're very good internally around the velocity of the internal information flows. So using tools like Slack and other collaborations and using things like Zoom as a way to share information. And finally, they're very good at helping employees to understand why. Why is it so important to use these technologies effectively? Second thing is they're very good at what's called affordances. And there's a bunch of research around the topic of affordances. But affordances means finding value in digital technology, finding how that technology can be used in ways which it may not necessarily be intended. We talk in the book about duct tape. And for those not familiar with duct tape, it's a simple thing which was originally designed to help to attach different parts of heating and ventilating and air conditioning systems. But people have found uses for duct tape. And if you go to YouTube, you can find literally thousands of videos about how people have used duct tape for different purposes. So when we talk about affordances, it's finding what's the value in this organization. All of a sudden, we're finding value of Zoom that we never thought would have been possible a year ago. And most of us had never heard of Zoom a year ago. But it's everything from education for seminars like this and so forth, because the circumstances have forced us to find new value. Regardless of what your politics are, we have a president of the United States, Donald Trump, who's understood how to use Twitter in a way that the founders of Twitter probably never intended. So affordances is finding value in technologies that may not necessarily be readily apparent to you when you first see that technology. And so affordances is very much around the ability to try, learn, and experiment. And I was talking with a client yesterday, and I suggested to this individual, I said, we can't learn these things from books. Sometimes we need to learn them by doing. And that comes to the third one, which is digital agility. Digitally mature organizations excel at cultivating a test fast, learn fast, scale fast operating model. And those of us who grew up in the world of direct marketing know this notion of test and learn. What digital technologies allow us to do is test more quickly and learn more quickly. But the organizations that are digitally mature are outstanding at their ability to scale fast and take small tests and then scale them up and apply them across the organization. So the organizations that test, they test small, they test enough, they engage cross-functional teams, and when they learn something of value from a test, they figure out how do I take it to the next level. So start small, test quickly, test enough, scale quickly. And finally, the fourth element of organizations that are successful when it comes to responding to digital disruption is attracting the right people. The employees and the leaders with the right skills and the mindset, that notion of experimentation, that notion of dealing with ambiguity and change. And some of that means location. It's interesting, in the US, we've seen this in Chicago, McDonald's, which is not an organization that many people associate with digital transformation, made a decision several years ago to move the headquarters from the suburbs downtown. Walgreens, a major retailer in the pharmaceutical business, has made the same decision. In part, that's because the 20 and the 30-somethings in Chicago don't want to commute out to the suburbs. They want to be downtown where the action is happening. Second is that they're looking at different types of employees. So employees that they may never have considered before because they didn't have the right skills and qualifications and credentials suddenly look very differently through the lens of digital transformation. The third is this notion of employee development and helping to give your employees the opportunities to learn. And one of the things that we heard from employees is the reason why they want to work for digital transformed organizations, digital mature organizations, is because they feel that they could learn more. And this was true across all age cohorts. So the ability to go to work for an organization where you are constantly learning is important to attracting and keeping and retaining employees. And more than 2/3 of the people that we spoke to said they will consider leaving their employees if they don't feel they have the opportunities for adequate learning. And then the fourth is to find ways to work outside the organization, develop the ecosystem of other organizations and businesses that will allow you to be successful in interacting with digital talent and potentially leveraging the skills of others. So how does this relate then back to how we're using technologies to create value for marketers? This is some research which was done by Salesforce. Many of you may know Salesforce, one of the leading vendors for marketing technology, CRM systems, service systems as well. And every other year they do research which they call the State of the Connected Customer. And this is from their research about 1.5 years ago. And they looked at business buyers as well as consumers. And what these consumers and business buyers said is that their standard for good experiences are higher than ever. And interestingly enough, it's higher for business buyers than it is for consumers. They also said that the percentage who expect companies to understand their needs and expectations, the percentage who say it's easier than ever to take their business elsewhere, and the percentage of companies who say that they need cutting-edge digital experiences for vendors to keep their business. So the bar is pretty high in terms of not just the products and the services and the offerings, but the experience that you deliver to your customers. Companies, based on a survey by Gartner, which is one of the leading market analyst firms, says that they expect that they will be competing primarily on customer experience. That the given is product quality or service quality, but it's the experience which is going to differentiate the winners from the losers in this world of digital transformation. Now, yesterday, Jim Lachinsky, in talking about marketing, says marketing is all about making predictions to deliver the right, best personalized experience. The problem is 85%. And I'm indebted to my friend Alan Schulman, who's going to be part of our panels, for sharing this. 85% of CMOs don't think their organizations are doing enough to personalize the customer experience. So the challenge of using technology is to create greater personalization in the experience that customers have with us at the right time, the right moment. And John Parker, who will join us as part of the panel, will talk quite a bit about content marketing delivered in the moment.
Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt. We are getting some feedback from our attendees. Can you be a bit louder, please?
Absolutely. I'm sorry. So if we look at then marketing technologies, and we look at marketing technologies in terms of customer experiences, and Jim talked about this yesterday, we're going from what one time were tribal experiences, then we tried to standardize the experience, then we tried to create experiences tailored by segment or persona, as Jim talked about, to now a world in which we have hyper-personalized experiences, which are very responsive to the moment and very responsive to the situation, very responsive to the characteristics. So we've gone from one size fits all to every individual, and every individual at a particular time in his or her life needs to have an experience that is relevant to what they're doing. And these experiences, when we talk about responsive customer journeys, one is a high degree of personalization. The second is that we can use technology to anticipate what people want and predict what they need and provide recommendations. So personalized and responsive experiences are also very recommendation rich. And the third aspect of personalized experience is that they are multi-channel. The experience that we have through the web, in a store, on the mobile device will all be similar and consistent and integrated with one another. At the same time, we're looking at technology as a way to create more scalable marketing processes. Because one of the challenges is that as we grow, how do we grow in a way that will allow us to scale? So we start once again with very simple processes for how we manage our marketing organizations. Then we create greater standardization about how we ran campaigns, and then we built reusable templates and tools. And now we're talking about marketing processes that are resource lean, data-driven, but they're also adaptable. And I talked previously about testing and learning. So how can we do a better job of testing, learning, and adapt the processes based upon the learnings that we have? So I use this diagram to show what we're looking for technologies to do. We want to go from inconsistent customer journeys to journeys which are not only consistent, but responsive to the needs of the individuals with whom we're interacting and serving. We want marketing processes on the horizontal dimension, which are not manual intensive, but are highly scalable using tools of automation. And we want to build some analytically based insights about the impact and the effectiveness so that we can adapt how we manage the journey and how we manage the processes so that we can continue to be more and more effective, both in terms of our internal efficiencies, but more importantly, more effective with customers so that we deliver the experiences that they want and they need. Now, Scott Brinker runs a website, and Scott Brinker works for HubSpot, which is a marketing technology vendor, and it's called chiefmartech.com. And every year he publishes a landscape of all the different technologies which are out there. This is the 2020 version that was published in April. He's been doing this for over 7 years, and he's gone from hundreds to thousands. And the current version of the landscape has more than 8,000 different vendors and marketing technologies to choose from. So it can be overwhelming in terms of what we do. This is a chart which is from Salesforce, and what they suggest, just as a way to get your hands around the complexity that's in Scott Brinker's chart, is that we really need to think about, on the left-hand side of this chart, the 3 goals of our marketing technology. One is to engage people. So these are the customer-facing interaction channels: web, mobile, increasingly virtual reality and other devices. In the middle is that personalization, that we can understand the identity, we can supply the right content, and that's what we'll be talking about with the panel, and then we can orchestrate this across the multiple channels. And then in the back is we need to know. So we need to build deep information about our customers so that we can personalize and then engage with them. Now I'm going to suggest to you that there are actually only 6 foundational components that go into a robust architecture for what the technology can be. Within those components, there are many, many different details that can be explored and exploited, and there are many different aspects that we can build on. But if we start on the top with the customer journey, it's something very simple: email. That's still the workhorse for most of the ways that most organizations communicate with their customers. And email capabilities are getting better and better about greater and greater personalization and greater ability to deliver the right messages in the right way to the right people at the right time in the right locations. We then have experience delivery. These are the different channels that we use to interact, and being able to build responsive experience delivery across the different channels, whether it's the web, it's mobile devices, wearables, etc. And then the third is that we can interact with people in social, and increasingly, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or other channels and things like TikTok and so forth, which are the ways that we manage our relationships in the customer journey. On the process side, we need robust processes and tools to support campaign management. We need tools to help us manage the marketing workflow, and then we need the analytics, which build the insights both about the customer journey and about the processes. So when I talk to clients, I tell them these 6 components are the foundational elements that every organization which is hoping to exploit the power of marketing technology needs to have. Now, to get the value, and this goes back to what I talked about previously, we need to start with a clear vision of what are the specific processes we're trying to improve, or what are the specific things that we want to do to become a more customer-obsessed organization. The second question is, do we have the right resources? Are we building the right marketing, technology, analytical resources, and the right organizational structure? Third thing is that we have process. And one of the things I find when I talk with my students, particularly in executive education, is that we've left behind in marketing the notion of processes. So if we are manufacturing products, We built the very process, going back to centuries, around assembly lines and quality control to make sure that we can build standardized and consistent products. And we need to take that same kind of industrial mindset and apply it to marketing, that we built processes, because in order for us to get the benefits out of automation, we need to have very structured processes. We need an architecture and infrastructure and governance process for capturing, managing structured and unstructured customer data. And Jim talked yesterday about artificial intelligence, but it all starts with capturing the right data. We need strategy and process for analytics. And then last but not least, we need a plan and process for managing the evolution of what we call a marketing technology stack. So these 6 capabilities are really key to getting the value from the marketing technology and the investments that we make. Now, I want to finish up and talk a little bit about looking ahead. So what are we likely to see over the next 5, 10 years when we think about marketing technology, what marketing technology will be used for, where are the big holes in the tent? Now, several years ago, there was a special edition of the Journal of Advertising. There was an article called Conceptualizing the Evolution of the Future of Advertising. And there's a quote from that: technology has irreversibly changed the way firms identify who are likely to buy, what they're more likely to buy, when they're more likely to buy, why they are likely to buy, and how they are likely to buy, repurchase, and recommend. So we can gather the information about this, and we've all had the experience as customers where we get suggestions and so forth. And I'm going to suggest to you that this notion of really understanding it, we can see in something about McDonald's. And I mentioned McDonald's before. So McDonald's several years ago made a decision to buy a company called Dynamic Yield. Dynamic Yield is an Israeli-based company which is focused on artificial intelligence. Now, if we think about McDonald's, and it's been very interesting, particularly with what's happened because of COVID, a big part of their business is drive-through. So in the United States, for the most part, McDonald's are no longer operating the restaurant. All the business is coming through the drive-through. What Dynamic Yield does is it reads the license plates of the vehicles that are coming through the drive-through, and then uses artificial intelligence to recognize and associate that with the last time that vehicle came through the drive-through, what was the order. Then they combine that information literally in split seconds, and they have a digital menu board. So as you drive through, it will present what you ordered last time, ask you if you want to keep that order or change that order. And then as a result of that, they're able to speed up the transaction as well, create a more customized and personalized experience. And what they're discovering is that this is cutting off, in some cases, 25% of the time for a vehicle to go through the drive-through. And just imagine that. In a world in which you've suddenly, because of COVID-19, had to change your business model from people dining in the restaurant to people going through drive-through. It's not that drive-through didn't happen before, and suddenly you're trying to push more and more traffic through. An innovation like this, which thinks about customer journey, thinks about the marketing processes, they've made the investment in digital menu boards, suddenly can help to change the business and make them much more competitive, but also improve the quality of the customer experience that they've had. It's all about recommendations that they're making. So one of my favorite books was written a number of years ago by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who taught at Swarthmore College in the US. And he wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. And in The Paradox of Choice, he talked about when we have too many choices. And certainly we see this in the US, but we're seeing it in more and more other countries, where we are overwhelmed by the number of options that we can possibly consider. And as a result of having too many options, sometimes we freeze, we get paralyzed, and we decide not to choose because we just can't make a choice among all the operations. So I believe in the future, the investments that we're going to make around marketing technology are going to be investments in recommendation systems. And we'll need to think about how do we build recommendation systems into our engagement with customers, and how does that fit into the media and marketing ecosystem of the future? Because now we're trying to help our customers navigate through the complexity of all the different choices that they have in the choice architecture, and getting that to happen in a quick time. And I love the McDonald's example, because that's a great way where they can recommend to people what they're likely to order, but of course still give them the choice, and do it in a way which also speeds up the entire transaction, makes that more pleasing and personalized for individuals. So the first thing I think when I look ahead is recommendation systems. Second thing I think about is what I'll call conversational interfaces. So once again, in the US, we have 330 million people who live in the US. We've got more than 150 million voice-first devices. So these are Google devices, Siri devices, Alexa devices, and so forth. And I believe that the conversational interfaces, when they're voice or text, chat box, voice-first devices like Alexa, will in some ways displace search and create opportunities for more effective media and marketing. When I say effective, I'm talking about emotional. So not only will we be able to have a conversation, but as part of that conversation, the technologies will be able to understand some of the emotional affect that we are experiencing as we have that conversation. So the ability of technology to help us to have the conversation, have a dialogue, help people to navigate through a very complex set of choices, but also understand the emotional tonality of what's going on in the customer's mind, will be a game changer potentially for technology. And third is, we live in a world in which we're increasingly concerned about privacy and regulation, which means that a technology which has existed for more than 20 years, which is collecting information about customers based upon cookies in their browsers, will probably likely change. So that means that as a marketer, I need to be more and more focused on what kind of first-party and zero-party data I collect, and less reliant on picking up data from cookies. And so I live now in a world in which I suspect that cookies will disappear in the next 5 years. And increasingly, we'll be looking for these conversational interfaces combined with recommendation systems to change the way that I interact with my customers. So for marketers out there who are thinking about, where do I go next? I've built the foundation. I've got a wonderful email system. I've got wonderful engagement systems and experience delivery. I've got my social meter wired. I'm continuing to add on new things like Pinterest and Instagram and TikTok and so forth. I'd say number one is, if you don't have a strategy for customer and conversational interfaces, you're missing the boat. So going back to that digital agility and absorption, highly recommend that you consider ways to try those out. So you better have experiences around chatbots and voice-first devices, and what you learn from those experiments, and then how do you scale them up. And similarly, if there's not a strategy for recommendation systems, and I see that obviously with lots of B2C, things like Netflix and Amazon and so forth, but B2B enterprises will increasingly be dependent and rely upon having effective recommendation systems. So just to summarize what I've covered in the last 40 minutes or so, the biggest changes that respondents cited in our research are an increased pace of doing business in this digital world. Second, a shift in organizational culture and the tensions between people who are trying to change their organizations to be more digital to employees who may have a more traditional mindset. The need to operate in a flexible and distributed workplace. And when I wrote this a number of months ago, I never anticipated that, at least in the US, not only we're in a distributed workplace, but we may be that way for a while. And at the same time, greater expectations of productivity. So those pressures are unlikely to decrease, they're likely to increase, and they've been exacerbated by the current situation crisis that we have associated with COVID-19. In this world, the greatest skills that organizational leaders need whether it's marketing or otherwise, is to have that vision and to bring the employees on board with the vision, to have a forward-looking perspective, to have their own degree of digital literacy, but to have that experimental mindset which allows them to adapt. Now, marketers will increasingly use digital technologies to create value by creating these responsive customer journeys, making them more personalized, making them more anticipatory, making them more multi-channel. By building scalable workflow with resource, lean, data-driven, adaptive processes, and building the insights on this digital trace data that becomes available as a result of the technology. I believe that recommendation systems, conversational interfaces will be increasingly an area of focus for companies trying to harness the power of marketing technology. But you need to start with the vision, the processes, and the resources before you start to focus on the right technology. So that concludes the key messages that I want to communicate today relative to marketing technology. I think we're going to segue to our panel discussion. And as part of our panel discussion, we've got three very distinguished individuals who will be joining us. And I'm very excited about that.